All right, we're going to get started just right on time. Well, I imagine people will filter in from their well-deserved coffee break. So I'm going to take a very different approach to, well, at first it's going to seem very similar because I always like to break people down before I build you back up. But we're going to take a really different tack from the previous presentation. There's very little AI here except for in like one slide. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of a theme behind what Mark was talking about in the keynote, which is that we're in a really exciting and also a really scary time. Because the innovation cycle, right, the business cycle itself is speeding up really rapidly. And bringing new products to market and sort of moving forward and evolving as businesses needs to happen faster and faster and faster. So when I did my MBA, about 10 years ago now, there was a set of research that came out of Harvard Business School that was really popular at the time, which is this sort of theory of good to great, right? What makes great companies that last the test of time? And in that book, the authors, which by the way was a really well-researched book, lots of good stuff behind the theory, but something really interesting happened in the last 10 years. So it was released in 2006. And then has been updated since. Of the 10 companies profiled, only 2 still exist today. Right, so of these great companies that had lasted for 50 to 75 years or more, only 2 of them are still around. About half went out of business. The other half were acquired for far less than they had been valued just a few years earlier. And the controversial thesis that I want to put in front of everybody is those were great companies. That was the DNA of what made a great organization. But around 2008-ish, something changed. And most of them weren't able to adapt to the new reality. Weren't able to adapt to that change. So what does that mean? Every company today is now a software company, whether they like it or not. It's sort of to use kind of or to repurpose a bit of an out-of-place quote, you may not believe in technology, but technology believes in you. Most of our touch points, our digital touch points, most of the things we interact with every day to actually transact business go over some software medium. And that's increasingly in dire straits in a lot of traditional companies. So the technology arm, IT, is really struggling to support the business. 80 to 90% of spend is used to just keep the lights on. I have a client right now in South America who is spending upwards of $200 million a year on just mainframe maintenance. Right? The IT budgets of other Fortune Global 1000 companies just on mainframe maintenance. It's clearly an unsustainable situation. There's a huge amount of data trapped in many of these legacy systems. Now I have an insurance client where they have 100 years of insurance data to inform underwriting, to inform rating and rules, and all of the things that are sort of pieces of competition in the insurance industry. All that stuff is locked away in systems, and they don't really access it to drive insights. There's a huge amount of market pressure in that new companies are disrupting, other companies are getting into established markets, and the established markets themselves in many industries are
Welcome back. Nice. A lot of people turned up. Innovation room.
That's
I can't say this from the organization, but Innovation room is the coolest room. Give it up.
Thanks, Mark.
There you go. That's what I expected. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, no worries. We'll get that. There we go. Cool. He's there to both introduce us and throw us off our game. So there's new entrants into established markets. We mentioned hospitality in the keynote a minute ago. One of the things that is very interesting when you talk to the executives in the hospitality world is that they can't build new hotels to get out of their revenue problem. You can increase bottom line revenue all you want, and when you have profitability and top line revenue pressure, you're going to see a decrease in share price. And it's because that core market is saturated. How many of us think that we can start a new bank here in Slovakia? and get new customers without changing fundamentally the industry in some way. Right? The established markets are really difficult to break into, except when you're talking about completely changing the game. So Airbnb was mentioned earlier. Don't own a single hotel room, starting to take a bit of the business traveler market, putting an enormous amount of revenue pressure on traditional companies. And in many cases, there's an unstated fear of modernization. Right? What happens if we change these core systems? When you look at core banking and core reservation systems, a lot of these things are older than almost everybody in the room. I have a hospitality client who has their core reservation system, the core code is over 50 years old. Right? The business rules in there have existed longer than most people have had a tenure at the company, and in fact sort of 2 generations. Right? I have another client that their core insurance system, there are literally 2 people left that were around to design it and can troubleshoot, and both of them literally own private retirement islands. So if you ask these people to work a little bit more overtime, they're gone, right? Then what happens? So we're in a bit of a precarious era, and we need to realize that profitability is increasingly tied to how we perform with technology. So some preliminary numbers there, we're doing some participating in and consuming some really interesting studies in this subject. Some of my numbers here is actually somewhat conservative, because I wanted to make sure that you say, okay, hey, where did that number come from? It comes from real data that we've pulled, analyzed, and made sure is sound. So there's an operating profit pressure. There's a huge fixed cost pressure of existing systems, and delivery speed is glacial with a lot of the existing IT estate. And remember what we just said, speed to market and innovating new products, breaking out of the trap of core markets is what folks need to do to survive. What they need to do to become the great companies of the future, right? What worked in the past doesn't still work today. So we need to get out of this trap. And I think to relate it a little bit back to what we just talked about in the keynote, if you don't increase human interaction, if you don't create more opportunities for customer service, you get into this vicious cycle. Right, where people will increase efficiency, quote unquote increase efficiency, by removing humans from the process, which frustrates customers. Customers leave the brand. There's bottom line and top line revenue pressure, so they increase efficiency and cut costs again, which has the same effect, and they will literally ride themselves into having customer service that robs them of all their customers. So, what do we do to get out of this? And I think we're going to walk through the first steps in transforming core architecture and building a technology foundation to help the business transformation and to help the great companies of the future move forward. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is that in the past, and still many times in the present because of an incentive problem we'll talk about in a second, but the IT part of the business, the IT part of most companies is extremely focused on cost. Right? If you look at their existing estate, most of the time, 60 to 70% of their budget is eaten up in just purely fixed cost, keeping the lights on. If they wanted to innovate something, they really couldn't because the money isn't there. Right? So one of the tremendous opportunities of transforming how we view core architecture is to unlock a lot of that existing funding and pull it into discretionary budgets where we can make bets on new technologies. We can make bets on new markets. And that has a tremendous ability to get us into blue oceans, to get us into areas where we can create new products and services that don't necessarily have a huge amount of competition, or that we can leverage our existing networks to bring customers in to much higher margin spaces. Mm-hmm. Oh, discretionary spending, yeah. So fixed spending, just kind of, okay, I have the software licenses, I have my infrastructure costs, I have personnel, right, all that kind of stuff. Right? Discretionary is the part of my budget that I can use on new projects, on modernization, on things that aren't just sort of keeping everything running, right? Cool. So I want to illustrate each one of these points with a little story, and I gave a little bit of a foreshadow of this a minute ago before everybody was in the room, but the client in South America, very large bank, they have over 20 mainframes, right? And it's a pretty young crowd for the most part, not as much balding and gray hair like me. So that, for any era, is amazing, right? Usually you have like one or two in a big company. They have multiple. All of them have to talk to each other, and a massive amount of their budget is eaten up in this stuff. Everything from core ledger to their other main systems, credit, debit, cards, all the things that a commercial bank needs to do to operate, is sitting in systems, and they're literally paying IBM for the privilege of running their own business. Right? It's not a great position to be in. If you're running something and you're paying half your budget to somebody else just to keep the lights on, it's not really a great situation. And in order to get out of that, we have to fundamentally rethink how all that core architecture works. It's a difficult problem to be in, but it's actually one that we're seeing a tremendous amount of success in, and I'll talk in just a second about how we're doing that. But we need to change how legacy systems evolve. We obviously can't just go replace these things, right? The 50-year-old system I talked about earlier, you can't just rip that out and put something else new, because it's not just 50 years old, it's been continuously developed for the last 50 years. Right? So there's real valuable business logic and sort of competitive advantage, in many cases, baked into those systems. So you can't just do a big rip and replace project. You have to figure out how to evolve. And you can always tell when engineers invent a term, by the way, because this is like not a very marketing friendly term, but you have to evolve and strangle those systems, right? It's called the strangler pattern, which, you know, we can just call it the Jack the Ripper pattern or something and have it be just as fun. But you take whole segments of the business that are run through those systems and you can move them into new spaces. We need to change how systems, services, and functions interact. So let's talk about that. So we need to fundamentally think of how we compose systems in a different way. So right now, in many cases, you have core systems that are sort of in that information hoarding pattern that I talked about in the previous presentation, where you have all of this information, all this data locked up in these core systems. It's very difficult to access. So, and all the business events that are going across, all the businesses being transacted, there's very little captured, or if it is captured, it stays in silos. And we ultimately need to move to a future where those business events, all of that data that transacts the business, that is customer-to-customer transactions, et cetera, is the foundation of what we build around. So make sure that we say, okay, here's somebody that does a reservation. We open that reservation. We add a restaurant reservation to it. We add some other cycling class, some other things to that, and make sure that those business events of those transactions are what's at the center of how we interact between different internal business domains and different external stakeholders. We need to make sure that we're being human-centric, right? I would be a hypocrite if I didn't continue my theme from earlier, which is empowering people with data. So just to drive that home one more time, in many cases, the folks that are actually one-on-one with customers have no ability to make a decision to help a customer service outcome, largely because, not because the people at the center don't want them to. I think in many cases, you talk to any CEO and you ask them, hey, do you want your frontline customer service personnel to be able to solve customer problems and make customers happy? They'll say, absolutely. Why wouldn't I want that? But in most cases, that data and the ability to actually affect those decisions is locked up in some system that those people don't have access to. So they literally can't. They have to call somebody who calls somebody who calls somebody, and then eventually you just walk away frustrated. So we need to make sure that we're focused on the actual business domains that are going to add value in the process, right? So if we're in hospitality, we need to focus on things like reservations and loyalty, but we also need to focus on building new business domains and entering new markets. And a lot of this will become clear in a moment. Focused on events, focus on modularization, sort of devolving everything into a series of services and functions. In many cases, you had whole areas of the business that are locked into a single code base with millions of lines of code. And they're incredibly fragile systems, right? So if you want to change a button color, you do 6 months of regression testing. Because you change one thing and everything's all interdependent in the same place. How can you be sure that your change doesn't have a cascading effect? Right? One of the great solutions to that is to have a smaller code base where that change can affect things. So making sure we're very modular, that we're very focused on helping folks think of individual business problems and individual business events and reacting to those. So I'm gonna skip past this for a second because I think it's there's a lot here, and I think the illustrations will help come back to. I'm doing the wrong one. There we go. We'll come back to this, right? But before we get to the architecture itself, I want to take us on a little bit of a journey on how we start to deconstruct this problem. Because it's one thing to say, I want to break apart the monolith and I want to strangle all these different systems and all of this. It's another thing to actually figure out how you do that in a structured manner where you attack the components that are going to deliver the most value first. Because remember, one of the big problems here is not acting fast enough. I think most folks, if you ask them, they're going to know what they need to do. Whether they can actually achieve it in time is a different story. Right? So if we are able to deconstruct the problem and make it into more bite-sized pieces that can deliver value incrementally, we buy ourselves the time to actually execute the full transformation. So we start with this process of looking at the entire business, understanding what the objectives are, and then deconstructing all the components into the relevant business domains, understanding which ones are critical for differentiation, which ones are not so critical. Right? For the most part, if we're working at a bank, we're not going to differentiate against our competitors on the quality of our HR systems. Right? So there's no reason to perform the rest of this activity on an HR system. You just go buy that. Go buy some software as a service. They work great. Don't customize the processes too much. For the most part, those things are pretty vanilla. You're ultimately not going to increase revenue, et cetera, by continually innovating in your back-end systems, your back-office systems. They certainly need to become more efficient, but for the most part, if you're a bank, you're worried about opening accounts faster. You're worried about offering different financial products. You're worried about tie-ins with other entities, like faster car loans and things like this, right? Whether you have an inventory of checks in a given location is probably not super high on your priority list for innovation. So we get this map of the current landscape. We drive all of the different business domains into sort of their own separate areas. We start to understand what happens in each one of those areas and what interacts inside of that domain and how they interact between one another. We start to draw an event map of that. What events actually happen inside of a reservation, right? Inside of a credit card transaction? How do those interact between these business domains, right? Irrespective of how existing system boundaries work. We get to the system boundaries later, right? But understanding how all these events are supposed to flow from a purely business standpoint, what is the sequence, et cetera. We map those back to the domains and to the constructs inside of the domains, and then we understand the context in which those events happen. Right? And once we understand that context, we can start to understand the flow of an entire transaction through the system, where value is created, where the bottlenecks are, where we don't have flow efficiency, where we can improve flow efficiency, where we can ensure that we're not having too many components talk to each other. And then ultimately, we drive sort of epics and other constructs out of that. And what we get at the end of this whole journey is a set of actionable user stories. And I think those of you who are students are fortunate to never have to live through the pain of a whole lot of waterfall projects. And if you do, please come join Accenture, where we do mostly Agile. It's be my only ad during the presentation. So once we actually have sort of actionable stories and things that we can hand to a developer and say, go do this, we're not quite ready yet. Right? We need to put that stuff in context, because in many cases, what happens is we get this wonderful plan, and then the Conway's law comes into effect. Right? Either we say, look, this is all wonderful, but we have to jam it into our existing technology landscape somehow, and all these events that you have are great, but can you please make it work through MQ series point-to-point queues? I'm going to pick on Max over there, who's standing on the side of the room. He called me a couple years ago and said, "Hey, all this event-driven architecture you guys are doing with Apache Kafka and all this great real-time transactions, can you guys do that entirely in an Oracle stack with MQ series in the middle?" And after I picked up my jaw off the floor, and I knew he wasn't serious asking, but he had to ask for the client anyway, said, "Well, not really, right? You can't take systems that are fundamentally not capable of doing sort of the types of interactions we want and jam it in there." So that's usually an easier battle to fight, because most folks are moving to the cloud in bigger ways than just doing kind of a lift and shift of their existing estate. I see even very traditional, very conservative companies starting to use more of the cloud native components and being less scared of lock-in and things like that. The one that gets us to the biggest problem, and this is where the story comes in here, is the engineering processes that go along with creating the new architecture that we're about to go through are just as, or oftentimes even more critical than the systems themselves. So what you can't do is, see, it was a good sort of dramatic effect, right? We got a good mic drop over there. So what you can't do is take, you've done all this work to divide everything into business domains, and now you've taken what was 5, 6 to 10 applications, and you've derived it down into 60, 70 microservices and 100 functions. Right? If you don't have a delivery process, if you don't have an engineering process by which you can automate things like testing, by which you can automate deployment, you've actually just made your lives a whole lot worse. Right? Because instead of having these really cumbersome processes with manual releases and all of this with 10 applications, you now have it with hundreds. So that process improvement has to come hand in hand with the architecture improvement, and making sure that we're following a lean kind of flow. And I mentioned flow efficiency earlier, making sure that even in our human processes, that we're letting developers spend a lot more time hands on keyboard and a lot less time wondering what the hell the user story means, right? Or sitting and writing cumbersome manual tests. There's a lot of components to all of this that there's a couple of DevOps presentations later in the program, but making sure that we have the engineering processes that go along with the architecture is something that is absolutely critical. And how many of us are developers or aspire to be developers? Cool. So a good at least half of us here. How many of you right now work without a coherent version control strategy, or work without writing unit tests and things like that? Or rather, how many of you want to work like that without the requisite amount of automation? That's kind of the answer that I thought it was, right? So in many cases, what you'll see is that folks like one of my insurance clients have a great desire to change their systems, but not a whole great desire to say, well, I'm going to give developers control over infrastructure, right? I have an infrastructure team that does that. You submit a ticket, they'll get it back to you in 2 weeks, right? The problem with that is that, and as we're about to see in the architecture, the infrastructure is just more code, right? So when you give a fairly traditional structure control of what is essentially just a configuration change in the same code base, you create a great amount of friction. So a lot of our jobs as architects and as folks who are trying to solve these big business problems of speed to market and top line revenue uplift, et cetera, also have to solve the problem of making sure that we're focusing on the right things and that we're not essentially stopping development at huge bottlenecks because we haven't thought through the problem. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because this is actually a bit of a throwback to my presentation at OpenSlava last year. But for the most part, the next generation of core systems is going to follow the following patterns. Right? We're going to build things in a reactive way, meaning that The system stays immediately responsive in the face of failure. I think this is one of the big reasons why many traditional companies are moving to more of the cloud-native interfaces. Because when you have things like a big Oracle database that has active passive replication and all of this, what they don't tell you, even in the fine print, is that if the master goes down, the slave starts queuing up transactions, and if it's not up fast enough, the slave tips over the moment it comes up, because you've just overloaded it, right? So if you rethink your data strategy and look at some components, I was talking to some folks from MongoDB last night and was impressed with some of the latest changes that they've had. There's others like CockroachDB and 1,000 others, right? Dynamo and Amazon, where you have this concept of a completely sort of multi-master, masterless replicated environment. You're looking at things where you can stay up in the face of failure, or handle failure really gracefully. It's not about building duct tape and lots of pool foam and stuff like that around your system so that they never break. It's building tons of redundancy and reactiveness into the system so that it can scale up and it can handle things in a globally distributed manner. And the great thing is we have technology to do that today. We want to make sure that things are as real time as possible. That usually happens through some form of event streaming. There's a couple of other mechanisms for that we'll go through. But reactive, real time, event driven, of course, making sure that those business events that are at the core of how we think about architecture are what we're transacting through the system, and decoupled, making sure that we're not recommitting the sins of the past and building new monoliths with lots of cute open source animal icons as the technology that underpins it. Even though having a little zoo as part of your dependencies is kind of fun. I don't have my laptop up here, but I have a bunch of the stickers on it that you can see they're very inventive with what they do on the open source icons these days. But making sure that we're focusing on that flow problem, focusing on that speed to market problem, and we're decoupling the right things. Right? I was having a conversation yesterday, I'll pick on you guys because you're in the front row, we have different business domains, how do we get them to talk to each other? How do we make sure that if you have 10 services in your reservation domain, and 10 in loyalty, or 10 in debit, and 10 in some other banking system, right? How do you make sure those aren't all creating a new spider web, right, of connections? Because this is ultimately, if you look at legacy architecture diagrams and you pull it out far enough, what you see is everything connects to everything, and there's no coherent integration strategy. Even if and we've tried to solve that problem a score of times in the industry, from ESBs to API gateways to everything on up. And in many cases, the real sin is not necessarily creating integration mechanisms. The sin is having the systems and services even aware that one another exist. Right? I want my services to understand that an event has happened, that they need to make a state change, or they need to transact something. That they pull in from some feed, they do it, they emit another event, and then they pick up the next one in the queue. And they're aware of the state in the transaction that they need to act, and that's all they're aware of. Right? It's a really key design principle in all of this, that we're making sure that everything doesn't have to keep track of everything else. Because in many cases, that was how we did things before, right? You have to build in things like race condition protection, optimistic locking, et cetera, and that means awareness of state changes beyond your own activity, which is a really, really dangerous place to be in. So what we start to look like actually becomes really, really interesting here. And this is simple, but it is actually a pretty good representation of what the future state looks like, which is that you have all of these services that are constructed in different business domains, right? The business domains are comprised of a certain set of business functions, right? So, and this is not like a super complex concept. It's if you have if you're a bank and all of your credit card activity, the transactions in and out, all that credit work is a big business domain. Right? You have business owners that own that care about opening new products and evolving their products. They're experts in the space, right? And then the engineers that are building things under that should also have some knowledge about it, right? So making sure that we can group those systems is a very powerful thing. And just to kind of bring that home a little bit, I have a client in the US who asked a really fascinating question, which is, we're having this really tough time implementing Agile. We don't know why that is. I said, well, your IT organization has 3 SVPs that own different ladders of the organization. The first one is plan, the second one is build, and the third one is run. Why do you think you have a problem implementing Agile? No one can talk to each other. They're all in different organizations, and each one of them owns a horizontal, right? So they don't own systems grouped by business function. They own systems grouped by technical function. So one group of engineers needs to know every single bit of business that's transacted throughout that entire system in order to make decisions that help meet the business goals, and that's often a really unattainable goal, right? So we have these domain group services. They're emitting events, reacting to events. One of the things I want to make sure that I mention here is that we can sometimes get a little bit too zealous about this stuff and think that all transactions now happen over the stream. Direct connections are perfectly acceptable in certain situations so long as they don't daisy chain out, right? So if I have an interface, if I have a form and I want to submit that form, there's no reason not to do that over HTTP and just call the service endpoint directly. Now, when that endpoint gets that information, that endpoint drops an event and some other service somewhere else will pick that up. It's intra-service communication that I'm worried about creating all these connections through, right? Not necessarily connections with interfaces. Direct connections with interfaces are how we've done things for most of our time in technology, and likely how we should continue doing things in the future. It just works, right? But making sure that we have these services divided by business domain that are emitting, reacting to events, that we can then take some of our legacy systems as they are and start to grab data out of them and throw them into the stream and then interact with them through the new domains, right? So in our case that we were talking about earlier, like having sort of core banking, right? In many cases, it's going to be really difficult to completely unwind those back-end systems, but you can take some data out, you can sort of segment out whole sets of transactions, start to move those through the new system, reroute a few things, right? And if you use mechanisms like change data capture, if you use some other mechanisms like ensuring that every write to like an IMS data store or BDB2 or what have you actually propagates up and is treated like any other event, you can really start to isolate these components, feed them into the stream, and then attack by numbers, right? And I think at the last 3 OpenSlavas we've talked about some form of this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But the other item that I think is new and interesting is starting to think of core transactions, sort of taking a little bit of the good from blockchain and not necessarily taking some of the scary stuff, which is to say a transaction is a contract to pay or a contract to serve. Appending that contract with new actions is actually a really good data structure to think about how to interop between different systems and different sort of large-scale business domains. So creating something that can run those core transactions, ensure delivery, right, allows us to have some of the same performance and stability considerations that we've had in sort of the really rock-solid mainframe systems, which is in many cases why they've stuck around, right? They do their job quite well. So we can have that same kind of stability, but put it into the new architecture vision. Just to tie it into what we were talking about in the keynote, one of the things that becomes really powerful here is that systems of intelligence now can interact directly with transactions. One of the things that has frustrated me most in our industry is that everybody gets extremely excited about AI and everybody gets extremely excited about different sort of real-time analytics and all these sort of predictive systems, all these different predictive systems. And in many cases, these predictive systems are run sort of in the back office. Some data scientist crunches some numbers, and they write a paper on the insight, and then 6 months later, whatever they found is actually delivered into production. And that's no longer an acceptable speed to market, right? So this concept of convergence, making sure that we have our different sort of domain-bounded services able to emit events, which are then picked up by some model that can add context and intelligence to that event, drop it back, and then have another piece of the transaction flow interact with it. It's a very, very powerful thing, right? So intelligence becomes connected to action, right? If we can connect it to natural interfaces, we're halfway to the story we told earlier. So you add interfaces and partners to this, and it becomes a nice sort of circle. All of these different components are emitting events, talking directly if they're in the case of interfaces, and then exposing APIs to partners, right? So I'm gonna end with sort of a last story here, and then we can go for some questions. I have a client right now that it's an insurance client that hasn't been able to actually issue a new product in 5 years. Right, so their product mix has stayed stale for 5 years. Auto insurance in multiple states, home, small business, medium business, but new products, new types of products, cybersecurity insurance, all sorts of like travel protection and things like this that they could be offering their customers. They haven't been able to, because actually interacting with some of the backends that they have is incredibly punishing. Right, so this is now 3 insurance companies where we're doing this in some level of maturity, where all 3 of them have been able to plan to, 2 of them are not released yet, one of them is, able to release their first new products in 5 years, right, or the other one in 2. And then they followed it up with a second product release in 4 weeks. Right, so that one was more of a product change, because a product release in insurance means that you have to get regulatory approval, and in the US it means you have to get regulatory approval from many states. But making small changes was even something that they couldn't do to existing product mix, or bundling products together to offer discounts if you do multiple things. After a fairly short period and a fairly small investment, what was once estimated as a $110 million project was done for 1/4 of the amount, and executed in 6 months instead of the 3 years that they had originally intended. So when you look at the techniques and sort of architecture style that we're talking about to power this transformation, this stuff really works. Right? So there's an increasingly large body of knowledge on all of this. We have we have a whole practice around it at Accenture, but much of the industry is moving in this direction, because frankly, to relate it back to the beginning, they have to. So with that, take any questions or comments or challenges, anything of the nature?
Well, I saw this in several occasions, like when you try to transform company infrastructure and systems from the legacy design and architecture to a newer design, you always face the challenge of the cost that comes with it. And usually that scares people, and especially the business people who have to make the decision to pay for it. How could that be handled?
You're absolutely right. So just to repeat it a little bit more loudly, when you're looking at modernization and transformation, in order to operate 2 systems in parallel for a period of time, or in order to have that new effort, there's an increase in cost associated with it. And often enough, the budgets are already constrained. It's very difficult to add that additional cost. Really 2 strategies for that, right? One of them is that as we do that initial mapping activity and understand where events are happening, et cetera, we can assign costs to those events, right? So in the South American bank example I gave, when you look at most of that cost that they're incurring, 70% of it was just read activity. Right? And in Austria, a colleague of mine who I don't know if Dominic, if you're in here, maybe went to one of the other ones, but we've repeated this now several times, where we took the read activity and offloaded it to a cloud-based system, and then saved that entire 60%. And like that graph that I showed, I think the 3rd slide, we're able to move things to discretionary spending, saved all that money, plowed it back into innovation projects. Right? The second one is an understanding and building a business case with the C-level leadership, right? Because in many cases, the CIO is incented entirely on keeping costs in line, right? So, if your bonus and buying a new car and buying your wife something fancy is tied to your ability to constrain innovation and cut costs, that's probably what you're going to do, and I'm not going to fault you for it, right? But if you're like the chief operating officer of that insurance company that I mentioned, she's a very visionary leader, worked with her to say, okay, we're not just going to drive operating costs out of this. In order to get out of the trap that we're in, we have to add new revenue. So let's build a business case focused around how we can change this architecture. Let's present it directly to the board. Let's get special funding for it. Let's treat it not like an IT project, but like a business priority, right? And then let's move forward and keep it going and allow them to have sort of room to invent new processes to move things along. Because there's nothing worse than trying to do this directly through traditional IT processes. It'll strangle it in the crib.
I maybe don't really have a question, but it's like a question/comment.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things about changing of the systems that have been in place for God knows how long in the companies, and professionals we've all met these kinds of overhaul projects, right? The problem there is that usually when you're switching to something new and different, it has different features and different functionalities than the old system, and they do not always overlap, right? So the issue that we're facing very often in this situation is that there's always that one stakeholder, right, who says, I need this feature.
Right now.
That's just the feature that's not in the new system, right? Heads up, who's not encountered this, it's every time.
A lot. Yeah.
It's a pain.
Look, there couple of comments about that. I think the second mechanism that I just talked about, sort of building the business case, often enough, okay, here's the critical path of features. Here's the sponsoring, C-level executive. And if that one person, that one product owner who owns that one feature, if that is really business critical, then maybe we move it up to the top of the backlog and move something else out, right? If it's not really business critical, but that person really feels that that's dear, sometimes it's a situation where the exec has to weigh the cost benefit, right? Do we reduce our cost profile and increase our speed to market, but leave this one feature out? And is that a sort of net ROI benefit?
It's a mindset thing.
Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely a mindset thing. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that person is hard to outvote when they have complete control over the process. When there's this sort of executive mandate to change, you can often say, look, you need to go talk to X in order to get this feature in because the critical path was this, right? Or the other item is, you can build in sort of a translation layer. This is a temporary feature to run that single feature through the existing backend. So in the insurance example that I gave earlier, actually printing the contract was something they had an existing system for, and they really thought it was differentiating, which it's really odd that their product is a piece of paper sometimes to think about, but actually putting that contract in the way that they did, tons of business rules, couldn't devolve that quickly. We built in a couple of services to actually send things and receive things from that print system, which is a big COBOL nightmare, but we ultimately got that feature in, right? And that stakeholder was satisfied. It took us an extra 3 or 4 weeks to get that done, and then everybody was happy, right? So it's a cost benefit between the two. There's not an easy answer, but most of the time it's about building executive momentum. Which, one of the reasons why Agile is so important in all of this is that once you give demos of real functionality to the business executives and they're like, Jesus, I haven't seen something move this fast in ages. What are all the interesting things that we can do? It's really hard to slow down that momentum once you build it. And it's also really difficult, sort of peer pressure-wise, to be in the room and say, I want my feature, right? So you just have to, once again, no easy answer, but there's a lot of momentum that can be built around it, and then there's also a lot of sort of executive pressure that can be brought to bear to say, look, we need to do this transformation effort. We will think about your feature later.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. Cool. All right. Thank you very much.